But yeah, we appreciate you joining the show here. I'm glad to have you on. I've told you I've wanted to get you on for a while, and I think this is a good concept to talk about because it's just been interesting to me. I know both of us, as kind of big sports fans and people that have followed sports for a long time, resisted the urge to get into the gambling side of things for various reasons, and I've held with that, and I think you have too. And it's interesting to see the change during our lifetimes. I feel like I always see it with specifically Al Michaels, because when I watch Al Michaels now, it was like he was allergic to mentioning anything about gambling, and now he has to do everything sponsored by FanDuel and DraftKings and MGM and all of those kinds of things. And so now that we see it so prevalent in sports, I kind of wanted to take a trip back to what it looked like when it first came to the state and kind of how you took that, and then where we're at now and some of the problems like a Malik Beasley, like Chauncey Billups, like some of these things that are happening, Jameson Williams. There's a lot of local stories with it, how that can kind of be encouraged by what's happening because it's so prevalent everywhere. But I wanted to turn the clock back to when it first came to Michigan and kind of how you saw that coming in, and then we'll kind of fast forward till now.
Yeah, and it's been a very interesting history from a legal standpoint, Ryan. As you know, sports betting was a little bit of the Wild West before and seems to be a little bit of the Wild West again. But when you and I were younger sports fans and then into our adult sports fans days, obviously there was not a lot of legalized sports betting. Basically, you had to go to one of certain states to be able to legally bet, states like Las Vegas, where there were legalized sports bets. And the reason that was there was a federal law called the Professional Amateur Sports Protection Act. And one of the big sponsors behind that was Bill Bradley, the former NBA player. And what the act was really designed to do was prevent or really protect the integrity of sporting competition at the college and professional level. What was interesting about the act is generally if Congress wants to regulate in a space, they would do so under a clear power that they possess, such as the Commerce Clause, to regulate financial dealings that cross state lines. What they did with PAPSA, and that's the abbreviation for the Professional Amateur Sports Protection Act, is they grandfathered in 4 states that had existing sports betting regimes and then told the state of New Jersey if they enacted a regime within the next year that they could do so. And then they told the other states that they couldn't pass laws legalizing sports betting. Now, going back to our high school civics classes, we know that under the 10th Amendment, any right that is not specifically granted to the federal government within the Constitution is violative of the 10th Amendment and reserved to the states. So there were multiple cases that started around 2012 when New Jersey sought to legalize sports betting. What New Jersey eventually did is passed a law that removed their restrictions on sports betting from their state laws, and this led to a series of lawsuits that ultimately went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court determined that PAPSA violated the 10th Amendment anti-commandeering principle and really that the federal government couldn't tell the states what they could or could not do to regulate sports betting. In other words, the federal government could only regulate sports betting if they chose to do so under one of their clear powers, such as under the Commerce power. There was one other law that was on the books at the time, and what you probably remember is we started seeing a lot of advertising and some movement from FanDuel and DraftKings even before the case got to the Supreme Court that analyzed PAPSA. And that was because there was an act called the Unlawful Internet Gambling Act that was also a federal law that prohibited the exchange of funds for gambling-type activities. But that law explicitly excluded fantasy sports contests. So what FanDuel and DraftKings argued at the time is that what they were doing was actually conducting fantasy sports contests, not sports gambling. It was a little bit legally ambiguous, and I think they were pretty happy when PASPA got overturned. But that kind of paved the way for this to start. And then when PASPA was found to be unconstitutional, we kind of saw the Wild West open up, where we had a multitude of states, including Michigan, pass legalized sports gambling laws, some of them allowing online betting, some of them allowing betting in casinos. It really varies by state at this point. And what's a little bit unique is we've still got somewhere between 10 and 12 states that haven't really legislated in this space, so it's unclear what's legal or not legal in those states at this point.
There's a lot of fascinating things in there, and that's kind of one of the main things that I wanted to get to is how it is kind of the Wild West to a degree. My first point is you clearly paid better attention in the civics classes than I did. That's why you're a lawyer and I'm on the radio. Sorry, Coach Sturzma, who's at Hope now, but you clearly paid better attention there.
I think we both had him for U.S. government.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't remember who taught civics. So that's probably part of the problem. He's the only one that I remember for government anyway. And he was a good teacher, but yeah, you clearly got more out of those classes here, but no, there's another thing that I thought was funny in there that New Jersey factors into this as much as they do, because that's the most New Jersey thing that I can think of is to be
completely
grandfathered into a gambling program. If there's any state, I guess, other than maybe Nevada, then you're thinking New Jersey there. But no, that's a good summary of kind of what happened, because I had forgotten about the fantasy sports element of it, but it was almost like they kind of had almost a Trojan horse in there to a degree, because they had the gambling on fantasy sports, daily fantasy sports through FanDuel and DraftKings, and then once they had those things established and then that act was considered unconstitutional and revoked, then it's like, hey, we're here and now we already have our tentacles here that can spread out and then expand to the sports betting. So I think FanDuel and DraftKings both, I'm not sure which was really first to market. I think there was some back and forth there between those two, but then you've got all these other places expanding into that space with just the sports gambling aspect, because they figured out a way to get in and then get the proper momentum to get it revoked, so that the sports, the fantasy sports part is really an important piece here.
Yeah, and obviously you and I had played plenty of fantasy sports growing up. Once those companies figured out how to monetize the fantasy sports component, it was pretty easy for them to be able to jump into the gambling space, and I think that's a lot of what we saw happen. In multiple states, sports betting has to be run through legalized casinos, but FanDuel and DraftKings already had a model for how to do this, so they were really able to jump in at that point, show the casinos that they could monetize their sports book for them. And I think that's part of the reason we've seen such rampant growth.
Why are some states resistant to getting into this? Because obviously the motivation would be financial, and there's probably other motivations. But why are there still 20% or so holding out from getting in there? Do you have a theory on that?
I don't have a global theory, and I think the challenge is because a lot of this is local politics. So probably the most notable state at this point is California, and part of what we've seen there is the Indian tribes that sponsor casinos within the state are very reluctant to have outside fantasy or sports gambling books come in and eat up some of the market space. So they were very publicly opposed to the ballot issue that California had a couple of years ago to legalize sports betting. There's actually a pretty big dispute going on in California right now. You may have seen that there are some companies that are popping up that suggest that they're not regulated by state law, but instead by federal law, because they're essentially selling futures. And so they have parties enter into what would essentially be a contract for a future for a certain outcome. Where we've seen this most commonly previously is in prediction markets for political elections, for example, where you can't legally gamble, but you can buy a future. This is what these companies are starting to do on sporting events. The tribes argue that this is basically sports betting and that they're trying to backdoor their way into the state of California's sports betting market, and they're very significantly opposed to this. I don't know where that one ends. I mean, presumably at some point, if parties keep finding creative ways to get into the state, you'll see some sort of settlement that benefits everybody. But it's probably going to be messy for a little while first. In other states, I think you see maybe some more of the traditional moral opposition to gambling and people losing money. Certainly, there's a little bit of a national push against sports gambling right now. And I think part of that's coming out of what we've seen with some of the recent court cases that have been filed.
Interesting. Yeah, that was one thing that was, I guess, not alarming, but interesting to me when I was in Cambodia, because they had casinos over there, but they actually had a rule that locals could not go into the casinos. They could only generate money from tourists. So I could wander in there because I was very clearly not a local, but I could go in there as a U.S. citizen, but anybody with Cambodian citizenship would not be able to go in there. So that's interesting, kind of thinking of it in that perspective here. But yeah, and this is kind
of the history of Las Vegas, right, Ryan?
Oh yeah.
It's become a sports destination at this point because every league has embraced what happens there. But for a long time, that's where you went if you wanted to engage in sports betting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now we have sports teams there, and that's where the development of this is interesting to me, because you're talking about kind of like the fantasy sports starting, and then that getting into certain states and starting it off, and now they're trying kind of another angle with these states that are more late adopters. But I don't, without some general oversight, because you're talking about kind of pressures from a national standpoint, but without general oversight, that you've got a lot of Wild West stuff happening that seems to continue to happen. And then the part that interests me, that maybe we'll take a quick break here and come back and discuss, is kind of where we are in modern day, which you have now such availability, because we used to have the Vegas. You had to go to Vegas. You had to go to adult Disneyland in Vegas and gamble and work with the sports gambling there. Now there's teams there. Now it's available in the majority of other states, but it's also too accessible to the actual players that play in the games. So if there was pressure before, there's even more pressure on the games with the availability and the amount of things that you can bet on. So that's where I wanted to kind of go with the conversation. But we'll take a quick break and we'll come back with Mike Huff and talk some more sports law here. Interesting conversation so far. Stick with us. You're listening to Sports Intel on Jethro FM. Coming back here with sports law expert Mike Huff. This is an interesting conversation, Mike. I'm glad we are having this, because that's great insight into how things got set up here, and then that's why I kind of had the impetus to talk about this, because now we fast forward to modern day and we have this proliferation of sports gambling in a lot of the states and across the country. And then we have these incidents like with Chauncey Billups, which that will take a ton of time to, I think the next court hearing or court appearance is in March of 2026. And they're trying to actually greenlight that in like September of 2026 for the actual court hearing. But we have that incident. We have the Malik Beasley incident. We have the Jameson Williams incident. But all of those things just make me think we could discuss each individual one, but it's more, okay, you've pushed so hard to get gambling into all these places, but now we've got to restrict it from certain people and not have them tied to it. And when you have simple things like the Terry Rozier stuff, where he's potentially dribbling the ball off of his foot so that he can get an under on a prop bet for one of his buddies, it's got to be it's hard regulate it in the first place, and we're losing control of the regulation within the states, and there's no kind of national oversight. And now we're trying to regulate it within the buildings, and you can gamble here on this, but you can't gamble in this place. So it's I'm wondering where you kind of see this going, and what kind of puts a stop to that, or what the regulations eventually could be for something like this.
Yeah, so you've anticipated where a lot of folks have gone with this issue, right? Which is federal legislation would help to create a standard across the country and answer a lot of the questions, resolve a lot of the ambiguities, and help really determine what this marketplace looks like moving forward. There hasn't been the political will to get something done yet. There have been federal bills proposed. I think that the market is evolving right now, probably quicker than Congress can address it. So we would have to figure out what would be the most appropriate way for them to step in. But frankly, that's probably the body with the best positioning to actually be able to do something that would create a standard that would help both the operators and the leagues and the participants really have a good shared understanding. What we've seen right now, obviously, is leagues, for example, working individually with sports betting operators to try to figure out how to make the process work for everyone. So, for example, the NCAA worked with some of these sports betting operators to get some of the prop bets turned off for the exact, sorts of concerns we're talking about right now. Additionally, we've heard about both professional and college athletes being harassed by sports bettors when they don't deliver in a way that those folks were hoping. And I think that there's an interest from the leagues, the players' associations, and the NCAA as an institution to try to mitigate that.
Well, and not to make it, that's really interesting. It makes me think of, this is going to maybe come off as a little conspiracy theory-ish here, but it makes me think of when with the famous incident where Lawrence Taylor was staying in a hotel and he purportedly got food poisoning from bad food from the hotel because the people at the hotel were fans of the other team. And it makes me think of the idea that, like, some of these people could, if you are getting harassed by sports bettors, you could presumably put your finger on the scale. You put your thumb on the scale to a degree and say, hey, we had this guy at my restaurant or at this place, and they might be slightly less because these little, just a stomach ache or something being a little bit slower could mean the difference between, a big day, say you're a receiver getting that big catch, whatever it is, a big day and a day that is subpar. So then you bet the unders. I know I'm getting a little conspiracy theory ask right now, and I'm not trying to go into all the different butterfly effect scenarios of that, but that has to cross people's minds to a degree, because there's a lot of people that just look at the angles of some of these things, and you've got to reduce the number of angles.
Yeah, I think what's helpful, Ryan, is the sort of scenario you just identified is where parties are generally united in terms of wanting to see some sort of regulatory standard. Obviously, the operators care a lot about the integrity of the game because they don't want to lose money at their sports book, and they want participants who trust that what they're betting on is fair. The vast majority of participants are playing above board. They want to know what they're playing is fair. And certainly the leagues and the players' associations care about the integrity of their game. That's essential to the long-term health of their product. So I think the vast majority of people want to see some sort of standard here that protects the integrity of the game moving forward.
I just feel like we maybe haven't gotten that incident yet that presses on the money, because like you said, a lot of it is money motivation, whether it's the league, whether it's the sports books, whether it's the individual players, whatever it is, to protect that integrity, because thankfully there are a lot of people that do have a vested interest, a monetary interest in that integrity. It's not just, hey, let's all get our money. There's certain sides of that, but it's the idea that a lot of people do have a vested interest in the integrity. But there hasn't been, because I don't think this incident with Chauncey Billups and Rozier and Damon Jones, I don't think that was enough to really tip the scales where any of those, there might have been a few questions in that particular news cycle, and then it kind of died out for a while. But I don't think that necessarily got close to affecting the getting into the integrity issue. It's once you'd involve maybe some officiating piece of it, because that's always the accusation too, and other elements. It's once you get into those kinds of things that there might be a little bit more push for it, because those vested interests are getting challenged.
Yeah, and of course politics is messy too, right? So even if you have unity with some of the operators and the leads, et cetera, it took them a long time to come together. And then you still have the states that are holdout states where there's political pressure. So it's not like there's one easy solution moving forward that makes everybody happy. And I think you're probably right that there needs to be some event that really helps drive things forward politically.
Yeah, it's got to raise to the top, because like you said, yeah, I think that's probably the most true statement of the entire interview, that politics is very messy, especially nowadays, and it's got to get over the hump of the other pressing issues, because there's even other issues in sports, because you've got the NCAA, you've got the NIL stuff that's brewing, you've got all of that stuff that is having some involvement from the government. So to get involved there, yeah, it's complicated, because that's one of the main things that I wanted to highlight in this interview, is just how complex it is. And you've done a great job in highlighting the multiple complexities, because some of these things, I always make the comparison that you try to reach in and pull the string, that you go, oh, okay, this is what I have to do, and I pull this string, and then you just end up with a knot, because each string you pull here ends up a little bit knotted, because there's so many crossing issues here, and different entities and different ideas and motivations involved, where there's not an easy solution, which is true for most things.
Yeah, and we should be fair. Certain states have tried to address some of these issues. A lot of them drafted their law based on a model act. Generally, states want to prevent athletes from betting. They want to prevent athletes' family members or others who might have inside information from being able to bet or throw the market. The challenge is you still have, with D.C. and Puerto Rico included, 52 different regimes, including some that are just blank, right? So it's very difficult for all involved parties to get fully aligned when there's not full alignment at the base level.
Exactly. It would be hard to get people on the same sheet of music unless you had a reason to, an impetus to, like we're talking about. But interesting conversation. I feel like this sheds a lot of light on things, and I like that because I'm seeing so many podcasts and different things sponsored by DraftKings, sponsored by FanDuel. I like that we're leaning a little bit different direction, because it's not that I'm anti those places, but that they can, there's another side to gambling, and I talk to counselors and different people that talk about the pervasive nature of it, and how it can it can have obviously a very negative effect. And so it's good to understand the totality of the issue and the different players involved, because then I don't like how it always gets boiled down. It's like the Pistons issue with Malik Beasley, because we went after him. He didn't end up getting signed with the Pistons. And then by the end of it, they were like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe there wasn't really as much here as we thought. But then that was kind of on the proverbial page 7 instead of on the front page like the initial news. And he, still is involved in some of the hearings and things and some of the investigation, and hasn't gotten signed with the team yet. So we get the headlines, but we don't get the full nuanced conversation like we're having.
Yeah, and I think the reality is, as you already identified, it's probably going to take a major case, and I don't know if one of the current cases will reach that level or not. It's difficult to know what really leads to motivation to finally resolving some of the challenges around this, but you've already raised things like NIL as well, and that has the same issue where you have a lot of state regimes. You have the NCAA trying to step in. You have universities sometimes lying, sometimes pushing back. And we should note, you've mentioned money a lot. The leagues and the teams love the revenue that's coming in. They love the extra eyeballs that are paying attention. So I think they're trying to tread carefully and maintain healthy partnerships with the operators, while at the same time understanding that if they let things go too far, then they're going to have an issue.
Oh yeah, I mean they've been building lineups around this, as you know, Mike, for a long time. It's like what I know some of my friends that were into this. They would talk about the Wednesday night Maction, where you could bet on the Mac on Wednesdays, and maybe it's not teams that you care about unless you went to those universities, but they're watching those games because there's a betting angle, or you're trying to chase at the end of the day and you're watching the Hawaii game at 12 o'clock at night. There's a lot of things that have been built around this for a long time, even before it became more pervasive. So it's why it's worth having a conversation. And since I have a close contact that's a sports law expert, I thought, hey, why not call Mike here?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad I could share a little bit of insight on this. It's still a messy space, but that makes it interesting from a legal standpoint.
Definitely. Well, and you're good at sifting through those things. And I was even looking at some of because when I was researching this a little bit and looking for some of the old articles when you were giving kind of the TV hits and the different media stuff, I had missed that you wrote for Cranes for a little while too. So you're a journalist in your own right.
Well, this was a pretty popular topic for a period of time there. There was a ton of uncertainty, and what we've seen is a long horizon, and the uncertainty has just evolved.
Definitely. And I appreciate you coming on the show, just because it was fun to have you on the show, but you gave a lot of insights to people, and I'm hoping that maybe we can have you back on as this stuff develops, because it is going to develop. I mean, there's not that I'm hoping for a scandal by any means, but there does need to be some changes eventually, and there are going to be some modifications. So appreciate you joining the show, and we'll look forward to hopefully having you back on here at some point.
Sounds good, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this, Ryan.
Definitely. Thanks for coming on. We'll talk to you again soon.
Great. Take care.
Thanks, buddy.